Good morning. Thank you for being here this morning. My name is Jeff Barraclough. I'm the Executive Director for the Manchester Historic Association, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here this morning to this talk about the Amoskeag Ledge with Ed Bruder. Before we begin, I want to just give a quick overview of who we are as an organization. I know many of you are members of the Manchester Historic Association, so thank you for your support. If you are not a member, we have information at the front desk about more programs and offerings that we do here and some of the benefits of becoming a member. We would encourage you to learn more about that opportunity. The Manchester Historic Association was founded in 1896, and our mission is to collect, preserve, and share Manchester's history. We do that through this museum, through our research center on Amherst Street, where we have a huge amount of resources available for people doing research on their families, on their properties. We also offer programs throughout the year and exhibits. Right now we have an exhibit right behind this screen called Manchester Inspired, the life and works of Mary Lou Ashu Lazos. She was a longtime member and supporter, employee, volunteer, trustee of the Historic Association who passed away last year, and we are really pleased to be able to showcase some of her artwork that's on display. So please check that out after this program, as well as the rest of the museum. A few upcoming events that we have scheduled. If you enjoyed today's lecture by Ed, he will be doing another one in March on Pine Island Park. So mark your calendar for March 15th. That's another Saturday and the second of our lecture series with Ed. On April 16th will be our annual meeting, and in conjunction with that, we'll be unveiling our next special exhibit in this room called All Bottled Up, that will be featuring the history of Manchester bottling and many of the different bottles and companies that bottled various liquids that were done in Manchester, and we have a huge collection of those bottles, which is a very interesting exhibit as well. Without further ado, I am pleased to introduce Ed Bruder. Many of you know Ed. He is certainly no stranger to the Historic Association. He is a past president of this association and a volunteer. He works at the research center twice a week. If you go into research, you will likely see Ed. He is a huge help to us, and his knowledge of Manchester and Manchester's history is phenomenal. So it is my pleasure to introduce Ed, and thank you again for being here this morning.
Jen, it occurs to me I left the mouse over there. It's on the right-hand side of the cart. Would you mind passing that over? So Jeff has me on the agenda for March, which means that I'm kind of on probation today, so you're going to determine whether that show happens or not. Thank you all very much for coming. Perhaps some of you have been at the ledge over the years. Let's be honest now. How many have gone swimming there? Fair number of hands are going up. That's a good thing. How many have not gone swimming but snuck through the holes in the fence? A few more hands are going up. That's good. Originally, we compiled this talk back in 2014. And it's interesting because every time we've given it over the years, it immediately opens up the floodgate to new photos, like the ones that we're playing for the last 15 minutes or half hour. All those have come into our association since the original talk was done. So maybe this will unleash some more photos today because there's a lot of stuff out there. So this is a talk about the Amoskeag Ledge, but it's really a threefer type of show. It's not just about the ledge itself. It's a three-part show. The first part is about the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company and its need for granite rock to be the foundations of many of these mill buildings that you're in here on this particular stretch of Canal Street and Commercial Street. It's also a talk about those intrepid swimmers who went there as the Brownies and spent about 10 years putting 4 shows on every year, inviting thousands of people. And some of the newspaper coverage at the time said there were as many as 15,000 people in the crowds ringing the ledge, watching these people go into the water. And then you're going to hear about Nora Kennard, a lady, perhaps you have heard of Kennard Road, which is near the entrance to McIntyre Ski Area. She actually kept the city from closing the ledge to the public for a number of decades because it turned out part of the ledge land was on her property. So we'll get into all that. But first, I guess we'll get into it now. So the Amoskeag Manufacturing Company is the corporate entity that built all these mills. It was a group of Boston investors who were all in the textile business. And starting in the 1830s, they started putting their money together to build this perfect mill city on the river, powered, of course, by the Merrimack and having the Amoskeag Dam nearby to accentuate the flow of water. So the city didn't get incorporated as a city till 1846. It really was the city of Amoskeag in its earliest days. The Brownies were a swimming group which appeared here after the active days of being a rock quarry, a ledge quarry, were over. They hit the water table, it filled with water, and was no longer usable to retrieve granite from, so people repurposed it. They used it as a place to go swimming without city sanction on private owned land. And that was a problem we'll talk about as we go. And then this is the only known photo of Nora Kennard from a 1920s passport application. There is no other photographic evidence of her existence, but we certainly know a lot about her. So today's presentation is part of the MHA lecture series, and we are fortunate to be sponsored today by the Ashland Preservation Group, the Ashland Street Preservation Group, Michael Duffy and family, and we appreciate that support. So thank you very much. So first of all, why do you need all this granite? What was it for? Where did they put it? We all know a view of the city like, well, actually, probably we don't all know this particular view of the city because so much of it's gone now. In the foreground, this was what is today I-293. It would be right there along the river. That is the east side, and of course over here would be the west side. And this is an early version of the Granite Street, not Granite Street, the Notre Dame Bridge or the Bridge Street Bridge. Well, you had all these mill buildings, a mile of brick buildings, and they all needed foundational stone on which to sit because this area is actually pretty sandy in its nature. If you just go up one block to Canal Street near Kidder Street and Hollis Street and those cross streets, that was at one time even called the sandbank because it was such loose material. It was not good for growing anything. So they decided to build on it. But it was soft. So all these mill buildings in this vicinity needed a lot of granite foundational stone. And they got a lot of it from the quarry up at Amoskeag, up at the ledge. I want to read to you an excerpt from a newspaper article from 1840. A granite quarry upon the river, about 6 miles above Amoskeag, being a mountain affording an inexhaustible quantity of the very best of that beautiful material, belongs to the company by purchase. Also, an extensive stone quarry or ledge not very far from the site of the future city, which, if it shall bear the same of the town in which it is located, may vie with another most extensive manufacturing town in England of the same name, will furnish in great abundance the material for foundation and cellar walls that do not require hewed stone. So clearly they were aware of this huge vein of granite. As it turned out, the quarry up at Amoskeag Ledge was not the best for building materials. They would not have built a building out of it, but it was perfect for foundational stone and some of the curbing that was used in the early days of the city. So we're going back to the days when they didn't have color yet. It was all black and white in those days. And you have seen a view of the city like this. To give you an orientation, that's the Bridge Street Bridge. This is the building where Peter Teldred's restaurant is located at 500 Commercial Street. I spent many years in there at WZID and WFEA. This set of mill buildings is gone. This is where the anthrax outbreak was, and these buildings were taken down in the 1970s. There were several of these bridges across the Merrimack in those days. Now, of course, this would be highway today, so all these buildings are gone. And you still can see these cutouts. If you're driving on the highway and look over, you can see these areas that were tunnels. They were basically sewage discharges. The waste that was coming out of the mills was just dumped into the river. This is still back in the 1800s. I like this shot because it shows you the area that we're talking about. This was an area of town known as Heath Hen Hill, and we'll talk more about that. You can barely see in this picture the outline of the Western Observatory Tower. And the ledge was just to the left of where that is. So it's a view of downtown, but it gives you the appreciation of where this is relative to the Western Observatory. If you're not familiar with that structure, it's just at the top of Darrowfield Park, which would be about there. So you would think that we're doing all this talk about Heath Hen Hill, which is here, but it's actually not the highest point in Manchester. Bald Hill is. Bald Hill is a little farther east. It's the highest point in Manchester at 573 feet above sea level. Today it's a little better known as Wellington Hill. Large residential complex. There's a big water tower out that way. It's kind of in the Stevens Pond vicinity of town. Here's a quote from a book that was written in 1915 called The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company of Manchester, A History, compiled by George Waldo Brown. The purchases on the east side of the river were greater in number, consisting mainly of farms, and the following list is comprised in the Eddy map made in 1835. Since then, what is known as the ledge lot has been acquired. So in those days, the people who owned the land from the river out towards Mammoth Road, there were huge swaths of land. Many of the Stark family descendants owned pieces of it. They would tend to be fairly narrow, but very long, like 1.5 miles or 2 miles long. So that's the area that we're talking about. You see Darrowfield Park here. This would be considered Bridge Street. This is Mammoth Road running north to south. Bald Hill and Stevens Pond in proximity to each other. Of course, today I-93 goes right through the middle of that. Well, actually, no, not right through the middle of Bald Hill, but it's this side, like there. You get very close to Stevens Pond. In fact, they've been excavating that for the last year. And Heath End Hill. So as we zero in on this a little bit, the ledge lot, so-called, was among the yearly real estate acquisitions made by the Amoskeag on the east side of the river, having been purchased soon after 1835, before the city had even incorporated. So we also see another landmark, the city park, or the city farm, I should say, which was off of Bridge Street. At various times, that was a sanitarium, a pauper's lot where people who had no means were sent to serve out a sentence. They would help grow the produce on the farm. And for basically, homeless people of the day would often be sent to live on the city farm. And as we zero in just a little bit more on that area, Heath End Hill is here. You see the West End Observatory. This road is not laid out exactly today as it was in those days when this map was put in. This was the city's first of 2 reservoirs. There's another one right here in front of the tower. And you see that Darrowfield Park was fairly elaborate looking, with this big loop in it. It was built to accommodate carriages for carriage paths, horse-drawn conveyances. And I think we have even one more. This was before all of that was put up there on Heath Hen Hill. Anybody know why it was called that? The heath hen is a rare form of rooster, which used to roam wild up in that part of town. And they named it Heath Hen Hill for that. There was another nearby operation close to the Amoskeag Ledge known as Bodwell's Ledge. And you'll hear a lot of the familiar names, you know, Bodwell Road, you hear Kennard Road. A lot of the early families got stuff named after them simply as a way to refer to other people as to where something was. So the Bodwell Ledge was run during the late 1800s by Frank S. Bodwell, who died in 1910. And after his death, that property was passed on to his wife's family, so it became known as McCarthy's Ledge. And that's what they demolished in building I-93 back in the late 70s and early 80s. This is an interesting map that we got from the collection that we have at the Manchester Historic Association, the Rowell McGregor woodlot. We all know McGregor Street without the E on the west side. The Rowell family lived on a farm on North River Road, which was one of those that extended from North River all the way out to Mammoth Road. So it was one of the large plots of land that was owned. This particular map shows the earliest part of the Amoskeag Ledge, which was opened in June of 1873. You've got a lot of compass headings here, and unfortunately I don't have the exact orientation of north, south, east, and west. But the significant thing to point out is that this is the road to Kennard's Ledge. So it's in very close proximity to where they're mining granite right here in a section that was opened in August of 1873. As it turns out, the Kennard family owned about half of the land where the ledge was located. And that became an issue later on in the 1920s and 30s. Another quote from a newspaper of the day, the Daily American and Mirror newspaper from October of 1871. The Kennards have sold several acres of land on the Mammoth Road near their ledge to a Mrs. Clark for $1,800. This account is confirmed by a record at the Hillsborough County Registry of Deeds that shows that John Kennard bought about 18 acres on Mammoth Road, and the deed initially indicated that it had been owned by the Frederick Stark family. So what do they do in a rock quarry? There's a couple of images here. These first 2 images are not the ledge. These are just typical of what a granite quarry looked like in the day. If you look really carefully, you can see little tiny people down here. You see this huge derrick from which there are a number of cables suspended. They would basically identify a section of rock that they wanted to cut, and using pretty much hand tools and very primitive steam-driven tools in those days, they would have sliced off what they wanted and used these heavy derricks and the cables to lift the pieces onto a wagon, which would look something like this. I feel very sorry for those beasts of burden. Sometimes they would use oxen, although we don't have evidence that oxen were used in Manchester, but that was sometimes used in various quarries. And you see there's, again, a bunch of guys over here loading up, attaching and detaching derricks. You see there's the driver here waiting to get going. And the route that they would have taken at the ledge to get the rock out of there to downtown would have been pretty much straight down Blodgett Street. That was the closest road. I walked that one time a few years ago, and it took me from the ledge to get to Canal Street about 45 minutes. So I gauged it probably would be a little bit longer for the poor horses that had all that load to carry. These next two pictures are of the ledge as a granite quarry when it was in use for that purpose. We don't know who the individual is down here at the bottom, but you get the idea. If this is the top of the quarry, they've already taken a ton of rock out of there, a lot of rock. And you see how they've got some straight edges. It's kind of remarkable. It would be really interesting to see how they cut it. We don't have documentation of that at this location. But you can see that they clearly have taken a huge amount of material out of what was a solid basin of granite. This other one is also at the ledge, and it's got the same kind of equipment. You see another very large derrick here in the middle, a lean-to with a guy standing over here, another guy right at the edge of the picture. They would have some of their machinery in here. It looks like some big wagon wheels, so probably a buckboard of some sort. Another two people over here on this platform. Some primitive fencing. Why do you suppose the fence was there? Anybody guess? Go ahead.
Oh, no, I don't know.
Anybody? No, it wasn't for animals. No, it wasn't that. The fence was there to keep people from falling into the water, which is already visible at this point. And this is significant because people think there's a couple of rumors about how the actual ledge filled with water. And we don't know the definitive answer. But it's clear that the water table at this part of town was pretty high anyway. In fact, back in the 1920s, a good deal after this picture was taken, there was a winter carnival held in part on Darafield Park on the slope there. They had a ski run that went down from the top of the park where the ball fields are today down towards the school. And while they were using a bulldozer to dig out a scoop to build up a mound of snow that the skiers would jump up over, they hit a spring. They opened up, and that area today is still marshy. If you go up by the school, you'll see right across from the parking lot there's a very marshy area with high reeds that grow during the summer because the water table is quite high in that area, and this is right in the vicinity of where the ledge was. So they already had water visible at that point. So once they got the granite out of there and walked it down Blodgett Street, this is where it might have gone. This is the Jefferson Mill under construction in 1886, which is up at the north end of Commercial Street, just up from where we are here today. When this mill was under construction, it had not yet been called Jefferson. It was known as Mill Number 10. In 1885, the Mirror, an American newspaper, published an article about it and said how much of the granite foundation stone was being mined from the Merrimack riverbed. For this particular mill, the river is just visible at the corner here. They were taking a lot of granite out of the riverbed and using it for foundational stone. But a lot of for the other mills that came before this one, because 1885 is late, and you'll see that this date is significant in a minute. The article stated that stone for the east wall of the building is being drawn from Kennard's Ledge by Warren Harvey, Harvey Road, and emptied over the old wall on the rocks below. There was another article in June of 1886 referring to the Amoskeag Ledge without mentioning it by name, and it said, considering its location, Russell Street probably has more teams traverse it, especially those loaded with stone from the neighboring ledge, than any other, and many pleasure carriages also pass through it, as it forms the main highway of the northeastern part of the city. Now, if you folks know where Russell Street is today, near Oak and Harrison and Blodgett and Myrtle and that area, Prospect Street, that was the major highway of the day. You can see that a lot of rock had been coming out of that area. So one would think that this must have been a huge industry, getting all that rock out of the ledge to get it downtown, but it really wasn't. We studied and found some data from James Hanlon, who wrote a research paper in 1981, and he had analyzed the working population of Manchester between 1840 and 1886. So over a 40-year period, compared in each of these columns, 1850 over to 1880, here's the number of people that were working in these various industries. Cotton cloth or textiles, 4,300. That had increased to 7,000 by 40 years later. Machine workers, that is foundry and machine workers, only 370 in 1850. That had increased, not significantly, but up to 519 in 1880. People who made boots and shoes, this was well before the later boom when the second wave of Manchester after the textiles disappeared and shoes came in. In those early days, boot and shoe workers were not really a significant part of the population. Locomotive manufacturing, in 1870 at the peak, there were 400 people building locomotives here in town, just up Canal Street. Gravel, stone, and stone workers, people working with marble and stone, there were just 5 in 1850, and only 36 in 1880. So clearly the peak was in the Civil War era. And then there's a percentage of the total workforce. It basically gives these numbers by percentage instead. So it was not a huge industry in terms of employment. In fact, we looked at the city directories for 1881 and 82, which were like early phone books. They listed all the people who lived in town and what their occupations were. There weren't that many people. I think there's what, 7 or 8 here? 8. 8 names of people who were employed at the ledge. So this was not a heavy employment deal. There were certainly stonemasons who were professionals at their craft, but it was not a very huge piece of employment. So the Amoskeag ledge was not the only one in town. There were a lot more. In fact, stonemason Warren Harvey, who I referred to a minute ago, was interviewed for a newspaper article in 1888. And he described all these ledges and more in the Manchester area, saying it's the best stone market in the state. There's probably taken from the quarries in and around Manchester each year 15,000 perch of stone. A perch was a unit of measure which amounted to about 1 square rod of land, but who knows what a rod of land is. 3 quarries alone furnish 10,000 perch annually. Nearly all of it is used here at home, very little being sent out of the city. The 3 largest quarries are those operated by the Amoskeag Company, by Frank Bodwell and Warren Harvey. I lease and operate what is known as the Kennard Ledge, owned by Joseph F. Kennard. So that name Kennard keeps coming into the discussion. Harvey said in this article that the Manchester granite was first class for building purposes, but not as good as Concord granite, which they would use for cemetery and monument work and for buildings. Harvey said he'd be paid $3 to $5 per perch and $10 to $20 for dimensional stone. The article said that the Clark Ledge on North River Road provided a large quantity of foundation and building stone until they discovered the Kennard Ledge, a new source. Harvey lists numerous ledges in town, including the Rock Rimmon Ledge, which has provided the Amoskeag Company with quite a quantity of rough foundation stone and rubble. Additional quarries in and around the Manchester area. And the 1888 article with Harvey concludes by him being quoted as saying, the Kennard, Bodwell, and Amoskeag ledges have been in operation for 18 or 20 years, and most of the best granite used in the city is found and taken here. A year ago, the Amoskeag Company, having exhausted its supply, purchased 60 feet from the Kennard Ledge. Significant, 1888. A year or so ago, the Amoskeag having exhausted its supply, which suggests that by 1888 it was no longer being used as an active quarry. So one other word as we get up to the hill here, this is what the original architectural drawings were outlining Deerfield Park. And it looked like a really beautiful park. All these roads were usable for people for walking or for riding their buckboards, riding horses. There was a large stand of trees at this end. This is Mammoth Road, north to south. This is Bridge Street. And this little path, which doesn't exist anymore, is called the Old Road because Bridge Street originally came up here before they built the park. Bridge Street veered somewhere through here. And of course, this is all gone today. This property is where the Red Cross Blood Center is today, and it was known for many years before that as the Hoyt's Riding Stables. So this is the pond that resulted when they cracked the spring at the lower edge of Deerfield Park. The junior high school would be across the street here. And this was a beautiful layout. And it was never finished this way because the city ran out of money. It was kind of a recurring theme that the city had great plans for things, but sometimes it didn't have the money to fund it. So this is how it was originally envisioned, but it didn't end up that way. The park was basically laid out in February 1890 on 68 acres of land. By 1910, they had purchased surrounding area and grown that to 90 acres. including the hill land on which the Manchester Waterworks built its new reservoir. The newer reservoir, named for J. Brodie Smith, was built directly in front of the Weston Tower in the 1930s. I think it was a Works Progress Administration project. So here's the Weston Observatory. This too was built in 1890. And this was not funded by the city, but it was funded by Mayor James Weston. Weston was one of just a couple of people who were both Manchester mayor and New Hampshire governor in their careers. When Weston died, he left $5,000 in his will for the city to build an observatory for the enjoyment of the people of the city for recreational use. And here in 1890, you see that the tree growth was fairly limited. Today, the trees are almost up to this level. And it's to the point where when you go up on the deck and you look out today to the east or to the south, you can't see anything but trees. If you're lucky on a good day, if the wind is blowing right, if you look north, you can see Mount Washington on a clear day, and you always get a nice view of the west side. But frankly, there's really no way the city can prune that because they'd have to cut the trees down. You can't just cut off the top half of trees. That would be nice. But the Weston Observatory has been a tourist attraction for many, many years. In its first year, it attracted 16,000 visitors, and it used to be left unlocked. Today, there's a chain link fence around it. Or actually, it's a better fence than a chain link. It's a steel fence. But they have to do that to keep vandals out. The Weston Observatory is made of granite, but the granite did not come from the ledge. It actually came from Hooksett. During World War II, this was used as a spotting post by air raid wardens, or to look for random attacks from the west side, which never occurred. There is another tower in town. Anybody know where that is? Yes.
At the VA hospital.
At the VA hospital on Smith Road. That's the Smith Tower. They were built roughly in the same period, 1882. The Smith Tower is actually a little bit older. It's not as tall. Smith is 40 feet high. Weston is 66 feet high. And at the summit of this mountain, it's still 537 feet above sea level, making it the second highest point to Bald Hill. We mentioned the reservoirs. This was the first one that was put in. If you go up there today, it's all surrounded by fence, so people can't get at it. There's a little shed that's over here in the corner. It's an engineering equipment shed. But it shows you how open the land was up there. The ledge would be just down beyond those trees. And the west side would be that away. The Amoskeag Manufacturing Company actually had a reservoir before this one. They built it in the 1850s up in the north end of town. It was bounded by Harrison, Russell, Oak, and Gore Street. Gore Street was later renamed Blodgett. It was a man-made reservoir, and they built it there and pumped up river water from the Merrimack to fill it in case of fire anywhere in the north end of town. That would have been their supply of water. But that was not a permanent one, but I often have wondered if people who live in that Harrison, Russell, Oak, Blodgett area know that their houses, their basements are built on a former reservoir. The AMC filled this reservoir, as I said, in the 1880s. 1897, this particular high-pressure reservoir was built. And to show it in proximity, here's your tower. The reservoir we were just looking at is just right here. The east is up here. Obviously, the west is here. And there was a time when there apparently was a little building of some sort up here. It's long gone. It looked like a very small pavilion, maybe a little observation area with a bench that people could have sat at. The ledge would be just off to your side here. This is a 1940 shot, which shows the two reservoirs. The one we've already seen over here in the little shed that's at the corner. And this is the larger one that was built. A couple of significant, well, you'll see that in a second. Notice that there are pretty open access here. And there's roads that would have come up here. You could have come up from Mammoth Road, which is here. Come up this road, which that's not actually the same entrance that's there today. Louis Israel Martel Road was put in there in the 1970s. But it's roughly the same path. And the ledge then would be just off to the side here. And there it is. So how big was this? It's hard to say exactly. This is a 1956 image. This was before the city had closed it and tried to fill it in. It's roughly the size of a football field, if you can kind of think of it in that way. The east side was higher than the west side, which is over here. This whole area is on a downhill slant. You can still walk a walking path through the woods right next to this. In fact, this is actually part of the road that goes through the woods. This road, that's High Ridge Road, and this is Skyview Road up here. So the ledge was quite close to neighboring houses. This is all land that was to become this McIntyre ski area in the 1960s, late 60s, early 70s. Another interesting thing about going up to the tower in those days, there was a parking area so that you could actually drive up there and visit. So what happened? Why did they stop using this as a granite quarry? This is from the east looking west. In the background, this would be the Unkanudik Mountains. And that's a bad scratch, so pay no attention to that. You'll see a little diving platform down here and a pavilion. Or it wasn't a pavilion, it was more of a lean-to. They took a few branches and in true Boy Scout fashion, covered it with pine trees, and that was where they changed into their bathing suits. But you can see that a fair quantity of material had been taken out of this area that had once been all solid granite. Why and when? Well, we have a newspaper article from the Mirror and American in September of 1889, which says, work has been discontinued at the Amoskeag Company's ledge for the season. That suggests that at least during the summer of '89, they were still working it. We know the quarry had filled with water by 1895, however, because the first documented drowning happened there that year. The Brownies began using the ledge for their swimming in 1922, so people were using it for recreational purposes before the Brownies came along. The Brownies, which is, well, here's one more close-up shot of that same photo we were looking at. The diving platform is here, the lean-to is here, and you get an idea of how deep this crevice was in the side of the earth. I think that the photos that you see back here would be the Smith Road area, and this might even be the Smith Tower, but I'm not positive of that. So the Manchester Brownies were organized in 1922 by Daniel P. Connor. Their philosophy was they believed in year-round outdoor swimming, and to be a Brownie, to be a full-fledged member, you had to swim for consecutive 365 days. They also had a group of super Brownies who took it to the limit. They had to swim for 2 consecutive years, including a New Year's Eve, in the water outside. So they used this ledge and attracted huge crowds of onlookers to see their 4-time-a-year exhibitions. To qualify, members had to swim in this documented plan, and they had memberships, and they used to gather for little meetings, first in the lean-to, and later on they built a cabin there. That's Dan Connor's on the edge, the left side. And this cliff behind them is going to be a significant one. That was the major diving point for most of their exhibitions, and you'll see other pictures later of this tree that was here, from which people hurled themselves. Anybody in this group do the deep dive from the tree top? No, probably not. Okay. Good move. Connor lived up in the north end, so he used to ride his horse up there. If that's how he discovered the ledge, I don't know, but this was an interesting shot of him. This next image shows Dan on the left. This was Halloween night of October 31st, 1923. The sign says City of Rocks, Halloween of 1923. Notice that he's standing on a board, I suppose because in October it's cold out at night, and if he's been swimming, his feet are probably cold. But that's nothing, because you'll see some other pictures of people who did far worse. This was a montage that ran in the Boston Sunday Globe on January 7th of 1923. It's the first newspaper article that I have found that documents the Brownies using this area. And this is a photo montage that they created. You see the swimmers scampering up the hill with their trusty dog. You see down here at the bottom, they're pulling out huge chunks of ice which they have manually cut out of the surface of the water. You see 2 divers about to go in, another one standing by, and another one going off the cliff up here. Several times the writer in this article referred to the club members as the Quarry Kids. They weren't yet being called the Brownies. It referred to a primitive lean-to near the water's edge, covered with boughs and about a foot of snow. The end facing the pond was open. Pieces of brush constituted a fire that was more smoke than flame. It described how the swimmers, all young boys, went into the lean-to strip off and pull on light bathing suits. There were no bathrobes. There was not even a towel. And then the article says, picture the sheer wall of a quarry cliff, a half-naked boy poised on a piece of bagging to keep from slipping on the ice or snow. Then the graceful plunge and the shower of spray as his body cuts the ice-framed pool of black water. This is the diving platform that I've referred to a couple of times, and you'll see several other times. And here's their lean-to over here. And some of the crowd of spectators who came to watch these people do this stuff. What's most significant in this picture, though, is this cutout. That was manually cut out of the ice with saws so that they would have an area to dive into of water. Any takers? This was the lean-to in close-up with some of the members of the club. The end pictures are their lifeguard, Harold Eastman. Connor was the head organizer, but Eastman was the treasurer and the manager of the organization for many years. And one other picture, the sign of which says Manchester Brownies, November 2, 1924, the first time we have the name documented at that point. The lean-to proved basically wholly inadequate, so that necessitated building a small cabin, which looked like that. And once again, you see the diving platform over here, right at the edge of the water. You would hope there's a pretty good drop-off here, that the depth increases pretty rapidly. Another view of the cabin and the diving platform on another day. And yet a different view of the same building. But you see the cliff across the way, the depth that they're diving to get into the water surface below. And you used to see these people crawling up on all edges of the rock, which was dangerous. And the Amoskeag company, which owned this property, was nervous about that. You can see the potential for insurance liability if somebody got injured. It's worth pointing out that we have not been able to document ever a single injury to a member of the Brownies. A number of other people had different fates, but they were not affiliated with the Brownies. While they were there, nobody was ever hurt. So here you see people on the diving platform on the left, and you see two of these cutouts that they did. They would just pile the ice up on the sides, another one up here, and to get into this one up here, you had to climb this ladder and dive off. Here you actually had a diving platform that was only about 10 or 12 feet off the ground. The sign, dangerous. What's the point, right?
How deep was the water then?
Right at the edge, it was not that deep, but in the depths at the bottom of the major cliff was 50 feet deep, 50 to 60 feet estimate. You see a bunch of people in the water, and I'll zoom in on this a little bit. As I've said before, the only person that's smart here is the dog. He said, I'm not going there. Not me. So you might wonder, how did people get to the ledge in the first place? Well, many came by horseback. Many walked, of course. That was probably the most common way of people getting there, because motor vehicles had been invented by this time, but they were still kind of rare in the early 1920s. You had to have some money to have a car, so not that many people did. Still others came by buckboard or other horse-drawn conveyances. We used this one on Facebook last week to promote Granny coming along, bundle her up, get her in the wagon, and go up and watch the dumb swimmers. And come they did, often not just by the hundreds, but by the thousands. As I say, newspaper articles at the period have documented 15,000 people at the peak coming to show up for one of these 4-time-a-year performances. The Brownies would practice athletic routines, calisthenics. They would dress up in costumes and put on little skits on the ice. And in the summer months, they would do it in the water. And then they would actually start the diving performances. I particularly like this shot because it shows the diving platform over here on the left, a bunch of the members of the group, and the high cliff with the tree that I talked about earlier. There was a ladder leaning against that tree, and at the top of that platform, or at the top of the ladder, at the top of the tree, they actually built a small platform. It was all very flimsy, and different pictures will show that. That's what they dove off of. I see a hand back here. Yes, there were kids, and they tended to be the regular Brownies. The Super Brownies tended to be older because they had been doing it longer. At any given time, I don't know exact numbers, but I'll show you a list of names here in a little bit that show the people that we know were members of the group. Dozens. Yes?
When they go co-ed.
That'll be coming up in just a second. Good question. Right there. When they got there, they went in spades. They used to pose for these publicity photos. Most of them have footwear on here, but they're lying in cold snow, in cold weather. It was a dangerous undertaking. 1923, article in the Union Leader, it was then called the Leader and Evening Union. Ledge patrons are learning self-control and unusual stunts under instruction. And the article said, this summer, there were several changes at the ledge, including the advent of girls as regular attendants at the pool. In the past, the boys had insisted on having the ledge as their own swimming hole and had banned members of the fairer sex from the sanctum of their activities. So 1923 is when it went co-ed. This is an interesting photo. Catherine Flanders. Bertie Flanders and her 3 daughters were all members of the group. This was Catherine, who was named the 1926 Motorcycle Girl, I think by Indian Motorcycles. I'm not a motorcycle aficionado, so I can't identify that. Is that Indian? And she was like an early pinup girl. Her sisters Catherine, Vera, and Helen, and their mother Bertie, all part of the group. This young lady was frequently pictured in the various publicity pictures that were issued. Her name is Leona Sullivan, and she later married Keith Cousins, who was also a member of the Brownies. Keith came to some notoriety, and we'll tell you about that in a minute. This shows 1924 and 1925, their New Year's Eve exhibition, which drew several thousand people. And we have some of the names: Lester DeRost, Marion Harland, 2 unknown men, Miss Bramhall, Joe McBride, and on the end, Harold Eastman, who was acting as the lifeguard, and he was the assistant treasurer of the organization. Wasn't at all cold that night, with the steam rising off the water. But the frolicking continued nonetheless. As I said, the crowd sizes were immense, and it's hard to imagine today, but even if you've never been to this area, just seeing that many people standing on sheer rock in the winter when there might be ice in the crevices is sheer madness. And the Amoskeag Company was getting more and more worried, as was the city, although the city didn't own it, so they could kind of step back from this responsibility a little bit. But you see they're out there on the ice. The guy in the lower left here has got an auger. He's drilling some kind of a hole for a skit they're doing. And these people dressed in their heavy coats are out there watching. Yankee Magazine ran an article in the February 2012 issue called Loving Winter. And they had this series of pictures. And it's interesting, you'd have some spotters at the bottom when they were doing diving. These are big chunks of ice that had been dug out of the hole to create a swimming hole. And you're going off a not very deep diving board into the water. This is a close-up of the people up at the top, up here. This picture on the right shows the spotters, and the next divers waiting in line for their turn. Look out. Well, this is around 1925 and 1926. Helen Flanders, who's down here in the foreground, and Myron Walker, who was one of the stunt divers. This is where they would climb the ladder to get up to their perch and go off this short diving board, and these people cheated death by standing that close. Interestingly, the newsreel services of the day came here from all over the world to get video footage of these people because they were nuts now. And it's interesting to see how many of them there were, but also the crowds packed in. We have some members of the group that were dressed in clown outfits, and they were doing skits on the ice below while they were doing calisthenics and exercises from the diving platform. And the people clearly were just enthralled by this. I don't know that they actually charged admission. They did have concessions. They would sell hot chocolate and coffee and stuff, so there was some money exchanging along the way, but I don't know that they were actually having any sort of a formal fee. We have something kind of exciting. It's rare video footage from 1927. This came from the British Pathé newsreel service. Sometimes this is a little finicky, so let's hope that today is not one of those days. It takes a second to load. But it's worth seeing when it does. You have to remember that motion pictures were still in their infancy in those days. 1927 was around the time of the first talkie, so Al Jolson's movie. This was in the primitive days, so the the motion picture is going to be pretty shaky. And if we can't call it up now, I'll bring it up at the end of the show because I have a separate file of it. It looks like it's trying to load, but it's not quite getting there. There we go. I can't identify any of the people in these movies. Maybe somebody in the audience can. Yeah, let's take our shoes off because we don't want to get wet feet. You'll notice the emblem on many of their bathing suits was the Super Brownie, which meant these were 2-year members who had been in and swum 2 years consecutively. Off the top. That I don't think that was at 50. That might have been old 55. I'm not really sure. People refer to the various.
Here we go.
See these guys. One of them's going to eat the ice. The other one's going to stick it down his shirt. So that one was 1927.
So that 4 below 0 was like Celsius?
Yeah. Yeah, because it was a British news agency, correct. This is the other one we have. It's shorter. This was from a year later. And it looks like some of this might have been in the summer months. And it, too, tends to be finicky. It takes a second to load. This does not look like it has as much snow and ice, at least the way I view it. But there we go.
How high is that right there? 55.
That's a 55, yeah. Here's the tree and the platform I've talked about. When you went from that platform to the water, it was 103 feet.
And yet,
So that one is short.
the Red Bull cliff diving competition doesn't go from that high.
That should tell us something. So the publicity was great, not only from the newsreels, but obviously the newspapers. Cameramen came from the world round. One article in 1923 said, "Boys dive from cliff to icy pool at Amoskeag Ledge to pose for movies." While floating on a cake of ice 2 feet thick, 14-year-old Richard Henry Roy lost his balance and his clothes and all tumbled into the water, but unexcitedly swam towards the edge of the pool and was dragged out, none the worse for his experience. A member of the club who survived. This was a famous picture of the day. You see a diver in mid-dive, getting ready to hit the pool. This was in a Chamber of Commerce brochure in 1925 and was so popular as a photo that it was hand-colored and used as a postcard, which was available as a souvenir for many years. This came from the postcard collection of the late Dick Duckoff, who was one of our trustees and members for many years. The Manchester Brownies Club wishes you a Happy New Year, New Year's Eve, 1926, or actually this is New Year's Eve 25, welcoming you to 1926. And you see the emblems for those who were Super Brownies. We actually, in the very far end, Harold Eastman wearing the L for lifeguard, because he was on duty as the lifeguard that night. We found in our collection a bathing suit, which the accession paperwork says was worn by a member of the Manchester Brownies, but it's navy blue. We have evidence from other sources that say that the original bathing suits were brown, and then later Manchester Knitted Fashions donated a set of ones with the new logo that were bright red. So you can form your own conclusions. Does anybody happen to know? Has anybody got one of these at home? Grandma's bathing suit? Well, it would make sense that the bathing suits would have been brown. That would make sense. It's an interesting article, or interesting that you mentioned that. We found no articles that make a reference to the L Street Brownies of Boston and the Manchester Brownies. As far as we can tell, there's no connection at all. At least we haven't found one. So the color remains a question, but this was a little bit later on, a variation on the logo. This was from 1930. So there's that diving platform that we'd all wish to be up on a cold January day when the wind is blowing. More and more stunts got more and more dangerous. Each exhibition, the members felt we got to top what we did the last time. We've got to impress people even more than we had. And Keith Cousins dove 108 feet in this particular time, which was 1925, a February winter carnival. Again, going off that flimsy tree, which was not much of a tree to start with, a little ladder to a flimsy platform, and off they would go into a not very big pool at the bottom. This particular picture is interesting because we've got a diver frozen in progress. We have his spotter down at the bottom. We have another person out perched on the cliff to the left, a really hard point to get to, and I would think probably a hard point to keep your vantage point. And somebody, again, right off that, that's Ted Leaf, who was a member of the Brownies in the early 1930s. And Ted was widely written up, partly because a German newspaper happened to be here on one of the days that he was making his dive. So they took a lot of these photos, and they were circulated around the world on one of the early wire services. So Ted Leaf became kind of famous as not a spokesman for the group, but as a spokesmodel. He was featured as one of the divers. And we actually have one of his grandsons here in the front row. Jim, raise your hand. For those of you who know, there you go. For those of you who know John Clayton, who was our former executive director, he also was a grandson of Ted Leaf, and you guys would be cousins then, right? First cousins? Yeah. So Ted was a pretty prominent member of the group in those days. The arrow in this particular article on the right is showing the diver who's just departed terra firma and is on his way to a watery, hopefully not grave. It's an interesting photo, though, because you see a shadow down here, which apparently is his shadow from there. At least I think it is. At least I'd like to say that anyway. The headline in the newspapers, 108-foot dive blindfolded, feature of Brownies Carnival, two guys, Esmond, Bill Mannion, and as we had said, Keith Cousins was doing the more and more complicated dives as well. Frank Provo did the same thing, but his was a 132-foot plunge in front of a crowd of 10,000 people. This was St. Patrick's Day of 1929. He put on a blindfold and dove off the platform at 80 miles an hour, or estimated 80 miles an hour. In February 1930, Provo made what could be the record dive, and this is the one that's written up here. The tree that had previously been used for a diving perch had now fallen into the pool below. So they had built a little tower, so it was a little higher than the previous tree was. And his dive was measured at 132 feet from the platform to the water. And he survived perfectly well. Francis Moquin was another one of the daredevils who did this kind of dive. He had to be lowered by rope to get to his vantage point, a 60-foot jump. The event was delayed while the thin covering of ice had formed since the thick blocks of ice had been cut out in the morning. There was another spectacular stunt in 1925. Robert Enright, when he jumped from the south rim of the ledge, 80 feet above the surface of the water. Then, to help thrill the crowd, he performed a remarkable feat when he ran off the edge and cleared more than 10 feet of rock, landing safely in the water. So again, crowd shots, seasonal. They would do this 4 times a year, including a summer carnival. And they would be doing a lot more calisthenics and activities as a group in the water during the summer months. All this was really concerning the Amoskeag Company. Now, 1927, 1930, you're starting to get into the Great Depression. Finances are getting tough. Employment in the Millyard is going to get cut back substantially. And the Amoskeag investors were worried. They said, we've got a real insurance liability here. We can't continue to let this happen. City officials agreed with them. There was a police chief who was installed here for about 100 years named Walter Healy. And Chief Healy agreed that this was dangerous to let this continue. So the very first call for the ledge to be filled in, this is one of the summer exhibitions, and I forgot to show you the crowd for this one. Look at the number of cars that are driven up there. So the first call to fill the ledge came in September 1921. The newspaper article said rocks and earth will be used to fill the bottom of the ledge, then a topping of fine loam to be afterwards graded and planted with grass to finish the job. This will once and for all end the nuisance against which the Manchester Mirror and the Manchester public have been crying ever since the beginning of last summer. It will rid that section of the city of the offensive odors emanating from the stagnant water hole, which proved to be a culture of mosquitoes. Then, in January 1923, about 800 people had gathered for the first winter carnival. 11 people were injured when they fell 20 feet into the water when the thin ice they were standing on as spectators gave way. Nobody was seriously injured, and the people who were there pulled them out of the water and bundled them off to the nearest houses along Mammoth Road to get warm. But the fact that 11 people were injured in one episode told the Amoskeag and the city officials that something had to give way. And then this one from June of 1923, boy 14 swimming at ledge drowns. He was not a member of the Brownies. It was Arthur Duval, who lived on Elm Street. He was swimming with 3 companions. He was halfway across the 100-foot wide body of water when he suddenly gasped, called for help, and disappeared. Ironically, Dan Connor was at the scene but was unable to rescue in this particular case. He tried to. He assisted in the rescue, but he had an injured leg from the earlier episode, so he was not able to dive into the water himself. Duval's body was recovered some 4 hours later. Frederick Dumaine was the longtime agent of the Amoskeag Company. He was like the head guy who ran the entire Amoskeag mill operation. And Dumaine was very fearful of what this was going to do. So in April of 1930, he asked the police for support and said, "We've got to shut this ledge down. We can't let people continue swimming here." Chief Healy ordered the area padlocked, closing it to the public, and he was quoted in the newspapers as saying, "Eventually a catastrophe is bound to occur at carnival time. All the police officers in the city couldn't prevent it if they were on guard." By early 1932, the Brownies had relocated to Pine Island Park, which we'll talk about more on March 15th if you can make it for that talk. But the Brownies continued in business for another couple of years, but this essentially was it for them in 1930. Certainly it was the end of it for them at this area. The Brownies moved to Pine Island, and they continued to have exhibitions for a couple of years. And here they are sitting on a block of ice playing a board game to show that it didn't matter where they were, but they were outside in the winter. This is one of the articles that we had talked about that listed the members that we know of. You may recognize family names. There were a few marriages that we're aware of within the group. There were several family members, lots of brothers and sisters, a couple of parents and children that were members. So that really brings us into the third part of the program. And I know we're running a little late, so I'll snap it up a bit. This is the part that wasn't so good because this was the part where there started to be drownings. Not members of the Brownies, but members of the general public. September 22nd, 1895 was the first documented drowning in the ledge pond. A young boy named Sammy Levine who lived on Russell Street. He was an Ash Street school student, and 3 of his friends and he went up there after school to bathe in the afternoon. The boy fell at the edge of the water and fell in. The others couldn't raise him, they couldn't see him, so they ran to his house to get his parents, and by the time they got back, it was too late. The Mirror, an American newspaper, reported that the Amoskeag Company will pump out all the water in the hole this afternoon in order that the body be recovered in as early a time as possible. And in fact, they sent 2 city fire engines, like the Amoskeag pumper that we have right down this corridor behind me, up there pumping night and day, and they finally realized, well, this is fed by springs, by water table. We will never be able to empty this pool of water. Sammy's body was finally recovered 4 days later, and he was buried in the town of Pelham. This particular episode had a really tragic second half to it, because a few months later, about 6 months later, his mother went up and committed suicide. She was so distraught over Sammy's death that she went up into their barn loft and hung herself. The next drowning that we know of was 1907. 8-year-old Xavier Champagne of Pearl Street disappeared. He and 2 companions had been walking on the city's east side, and they got disoriented about where they were. They knew Darrowfield Park, but they weren't familiar with the ledge area. An extensive pond search was conducted at Stevens Pond, but of course that turned out to be the wrong location. It was actually at the ledge where his body was last seen. And this was a body that was never recovered. Divers and state police came and used dynamite, thinking that perhaps he had gone under the pool of water and got stuck under a shelf of rock. And if we throw dynamite in there, it will shake his body loose. Apparently, it never occurred to anybody that if you use dynamite, it might also blow up the remains. Either way, the body of Xavier Champagne was never found. This is a list of the known deaths that we've been able to document. And you'll notice that a fair amount of them were ruled suicide or probable suicide. Arthur Duval was next in 1923. A housewife named Nellie McEachran took her life there in 1926. Nancy Carpenter in 1927 was really tragic. She had left her little 3.5-year-old daughter alone in the bathtub taking a bath while she had to run an errand. And by the time she got back to her house, the baby had drowned, and she went up to the ledge and hurled herself in as a suicide. Romeo Talbot in 1946 was a postal worker, and he disappeared, and they found no trace for quite a while, then some clothing washed up, and they eventually did recover the body. But they were able to identify him from very badly water-damaged papers that were found on his clothing. 1950, the body of a retired bus driver, Cornelius Murphy, was found. He had been missing since the previous November. His death was ruled accidental. 1955, James Scully left Bishop Bradley High School, which is where Trinity is today, and went over to test out the ice because he and his buddies wanted to play hockey after school. He fell in, was never seen again. That body was not recovered. The searches for the various drowning victims were fairly rudimentary. They used grappling hooks, a rope with heavy metal hooks on them. The possibility is if you snag the body, you might actually tear their flesh. They didn't have divers that could go in there. On some of the later ones in the 1940s and 50s, they did get some divers from the Portsmouth Navy Yard came over, and they did not find bodies, but as they went down to the bottom of the pool, they found tools and a lot of the cabling from the derricks that had originally been there that was all still in place. So all that diving into those pools of shovels and what do you call them, the hose and the picks and so forth that they would have been using, that was all down there waiting to injure people. So clearly the city had pretty much had enough. In 1929, Hector Bover went missing. His clothes were found piled up on the side of the ledge. They used dynamite in his case in an effort to dislodge the body, and it was finally found about 3 weeks later. During the search for Hector Bover, who died in 1929, they found a car at the bottom of the ledge. The car had been owned by Dr. Frank Warren, who lived up on Bridge Street. Said the body of the car was in pretty good condition. It was a touring car, which naturally suffered in the watery grave. The machine was in gear, and the key used in stealing the car was still in the ignition lock. 3 of the tires are still in good condition, filled with air. The radiator was filled with water, but the odor of alcohol placed in it for the winter of 1928 remains. The top of the car is smashed, however, the running boards badly damaged. The windshield and headlights and other lights are all broken. It was apparently pushed in from the north shore of the ledge after it had been stolen. This map is a little hard to see. It's Dairyfield Park down here on the bottom. This is the smaller of the 2 reservoirs, so the Weston Tower would have been right about there. The other reservoir is being laid out but is not yet built. And this would be the ledge pond. And you notice there's a line right through the middle of it. If we zoom in on this map, you'll see why. This 3.65 acres was owned by the Amoskeag Company, which had now deeded it to the city. But this big chunk of it was owned by Nora Jones, who was the daughter of one of the Kennard brothers. The city had proposed using the ledge for a dump as early as 1935. A newspaper article in the Leader said the opposition to the place met with little success because part of the land was owned by the Kennards, who favored the use of the pool for swimming. It was then proposed by city officials to use the ledge as the city dump. A past owner of the property, Mrs. Nora K. Jones, threatened legal action to stop any such use of the ledge, so city officials backed down. Clearly, even though swimming had been banned and the city had said no more, kids were still using it. This is a front page photo that George Naum took for the Union Leader in June of 1958. Frank Harlan of Auburn Street taking his dive on a hot summer day. And another picture from around the same time. This was 1963, I believe. And clearly people were still getting in there because there was no way to, no geographic barriers to keep them out. Well, in July of 1982, 26-year-old Billy Murphy of Sagamore Street drowned while swimming with friends about 2 o'clock in the morning up there. He went under, never came up. Incidentally, Murphy's brother, John, is Jack Murphy, many people may remember as a Manchester police officer and former Hillsborough County Sheriff. Exactly a year later, in June of 1983, another drowning occurred. 19-year-old Gary Victorin drowned while swimming in the ledge just the week after graduating from Central. The city said, that's it, we're closing the place. Mayor Emil Bolio went to the alderman and said, you need to authorize the money to put a fence around the entire place, which they did. They started in 1983. A 7-foot-high razor wire topped fence at a total cost of $30,000. They used a lot of fill from the west side. In fact, the area from Gosler Park, when that was raised in 1985, the hill was leveled and graded from Ribbon all the way to Blucher Street, and that fill was all dumped into the ledge. The effort was to close it down so people couldn't go swimming any further. Well, this brings us to the Kennard family. Samuel and Mary got married, had 7 children, 5 of whom were boys, and they were all very prominent in their fields and in their endeavors. The Diamond Kennard house was located at 609 Beach Street, right near Bridge Street, and is still there. And John Kennard, one of the brothers, lived in this house, which was originally up behind the Currier Art Gallery and was moved several years ago and taken in as one of the Currier properties. And I'm not sure if the Currier still owns it. I think they may have sold it off in the last couple of years. Yeah, I think you're right. Dean came and bought that. But that's at the corner of Orange and Beach Street. Well, Joseph F. Kennard was the youngest son. He married Rebecca Tufts, and they had only one child, Nora F. Kennard. She and Edwin Jones had one child who died in infancy, so they essentially had no issue, certainly no heirs. The Kennard family, however, built a huge building on Elm Street. The Kennard block was a prominent area of business. It was the shishi place to be if you were in business in Manchester. That's what it looked like before. This was built in 1892. That's what it looked like after, a massive fire. The fire happened in 1894. The building was hardly a year old. I'm sorry, I take that back. I'm wrong with my date. It was January of 1902. Fighting a fire in 1902, you didn't have modern equipment. You had hydrants which froze. You had hoses that froze. You were still using horse-drawn fire engines. Keeping the horses outside in cold January temperatures was a problem. The building was a total loss. Some tenants were able to get some documents out, and those that had safes in their businesses were able to retrieve the safes. But the building was basically finished.
Where was that?
This was on Elm Street, the same side as City Hall, about a block north. So it's kind of in the area where Hampshire Plaza or the Brady Sullivan Tower is today. And you're seeing it from a couple of different angles, one from the side street and one from Elm Street. So what happens? Joseph Kennard was getting up one morning, doing his morning shave, and collapsed. He died on the spot. His will had left the parcel of land up near the ledge to his wife, but she had already passed by this time. So it actually was inherited by his daughter, Nora. And he left 7 pieces of property that were in question in his will. And you notice that one of them, listed here as Mammoth Road, 43.844 acres. That was the area where the ledge was. And you see from this map that was at the Hillsborough County Treasury, Samuel Kennard, his brother, owned 8 acres up here. John Kennard owned 16 acres here, and his daughter Nora owned this chunk, and here was the Amoskeag Company's area for the ledge. Nora's husband, Edwin, was a pretty prominent guy in town at the time. He had a lot of credentials to his name, which are not particularly germane to this talk, so I'm not going to dwell on them. But this was Nora, and she favored keeping the ledge pool open. A Union Leader article that was written in 1947, Swimming a Ledge Called Tradition, says, early opposition to the place met with little success because part of the land was owned by the Kennards, who favored the use of the pool for swimming. It was then proposed by city officials to use the ledge as a city dump. A past owner of the property, Mrs. Nora K. Jones, threatened legal action to stop any such use of the ledge, So city officials backed down. Now, she died in 1937, but it took several years to actually administer her will because she was quite a wealthy lady. The newspaper headlines were fairly sparse. She was prominent in town, but she did not belong to many organizations, so people knew who she was, but she was not a leader in civic activities. So, thanks to Google Earth, we get an idea today. In fact, when I say today, I mean this is 2014, I believe. The Ledge property is up here. The Weston Observatory is here. And you see one of the two reservoirs. The other one is just off the bottom of the picture here. This looks circular today. It is circular today. Anybody know why? Because of the EPA. Somewhere along the 1960s or 70s, they said you can't have a big open pool of drinking water or reservoir where birds can do their stuff in it. So you've got to enclose it. So what used to be an open to the air enclosure here was filled in with a big circular tank in the middle, a covered tank. It's a huge concrete tank. It holds millions of gallons of city water, which is all gravity fed into the city. And if you live in town, that's what you're drinking. This pool, too, is no longer open to the air at the bottom. This is covered with a rubber tarpaulin type of surface. The lighting here.
What's McIntyre ski area in relation to this?
You can see the snow.
This is the top of the McIntyre ski lift right here.
Oh,
And if you went right down the hill that way, that would take you to the base lodge. This would be the ledge here. And it's almost totally greened in. Google Earth today, in fact, I didn't even use a Google Earth picture from 2024 or 5 because it's so greened in, you can't really tell the difference between it and the surrounding neighborhood. There is still water in the bottom of it, and they'd never really filled it in. They did dump tons of brush and stumps and leaves and things in there, but you really can't entirely, fill in something the size of a football stadium with fill. Now there's been 40 years of tree growth in the meantime, so the trees have grown up there. You couldn't dive off. You'd end up in the arms of a tree. This is one of the 2 holes that I know of in the fence that go around it. Now, it's a 7-foot high chain link fence, and you are not supposed to go in there, and I'm recommending that you don't do it. But in case you find yourself there, this is another view of the top of the McIntyre ski lift. It's that close to the property. In case you find yourself inside the hole of the fence, you're going to see all this razor-sharp barbed wire, which is now 40 years filled with rust. And if you cut yourself on that, you're going to get a beautiful case of tetanus. So the city means it when they say people should not go in here. Again, if you do, however, you may come across sites like this. That's the cliff where the tree used to be that people used to jump off of. And you see how the 40 years of tree growth is almost up to the top of that cliff now. Another view of the same shot with the dense undergrowth. There's a little bit of snow down here. I think this was a November shot. I think all of these were taken in November. You can see some water down here at the very bottom. And if you stepped out on these leaves, you'd probably collapse to probably your ankles in water. And back in the 50s and 60s, there was tons of graffiti on the sides of these rocks. I don't know how the people got there to paint them, but the graffiti is even more intense and in-depth today. I don't know what this represents. I don't know enough about graffiti to tell you who painted them, but it's all over the place up there. So, no. I forget.
it was a drone.
Yeah, a drone. It was before they had drones, for sure. So that concludes the formal part of the presentation. I'd be glad to try to answer any questions people have. Yes, sir.
Probably the most famous piece of graffiti was the acrobats up at the top.
Yes.
Yeah, that was pretty cool.
Again, I don't know how people would have done that. They probably would have been lowered by ropes
Yeah.
because you couldn't climb down that carrying paint cans and brushes.
Yeah.
But people will do anything for the thrill, right?
Yeah.
Those guys were called the Flying Frenchmen. There was 3 of them.
Were they brothers?
What do you think?
Exactly. Yes, sir.
Well, I thought we drank Lake Massachusetts water.
You might be, depending where you live in town, but the downtown section is served from the Darafield Hill reservoirs. The South Mammoth Road one, that area, that takes care of the whole south end of town. Michael?
There's two, the hydrants, yellow barrel and red cap.
Mhm.
Was served from the high service reservoirs.
Is that what this scheme is? Yellow hydrants with red caps?
The first, yeah, because it's a higher pressure, it's a higher elevation. There's road, it's a low service, it serves the lower elevation,
Yeah.
the yellow barrel with black cap. The
Interesting.
Wellington Hill section has yellow barrel.
And that tank that's on Wellington Hill serves that community, doesn't it?
That is correct. You see, hydrant green bottom with cap, served by Wellington Hill.
Wow.
Because when they developed that, I remember they built that tower on the south side. Then when they built that, they were just developing that because it got higher elevation.
Okay. Two things. The city has an internship program every summer for one person who's hired specifically to paint fire hydrants, to put fresh coats of paint on them. So if you have a teenager who needs a summer job, keep that in mind, Parks and Rec. And the other thing is, that's Michael Duffy, and he is our sponsor today from the Ashland Street Preservation Group.
No, that's John Burkish.
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's, he's a fire captain.
Duffy's over here. All right. Well, I'll give you Duffy credit too. You look like Mike from here.
Worked in a fire department.
So you know.
Yeah, we went into it.
So you had to work with Stan Garrity, probably.
Oh, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And me.
Oh, there you go.
So, that's the quality because it was part of our job, was to know where everything was going.
Yeah.
And knowing how big the mains are on each street. Let's look up Fairview Park, down in the city, there's like 36 or 42 inch main comes down.
Oh.
But you gotta know that, you know, if you're on a certain street, you know, along a small main, so you have to go on top. You've got big, huge 60-inch mains. Good.
Aren't you glad there's not going to be a quiz today? Thank you for that information. I didn't know any of that, so that's good to know. Any other questions people have or comments? Sir?
Yes, I grew up in the area in the 1950s, and that was our favorite swimming hole. I lived on East High Street and used to cross Darafield Park and go up the side of the hill and across where the Western Tower is to get to the ledge. And it was considered the best swimming, the purest water. There was a lot of legends, one of which was it was bottomless. There was no bottom to it, and if you get down low enough, the water would start to get warm because you were closer to hell.
That's a good story. I hadn't heard that one.
But it was famous at that period of time because they always tried to close it, and they put up a fence, and almost within a day, the fence would be down and people would be in there swimming, so.
Now, this man collects swimming holes. This is Merrill Lewis, who lives today on Pine Island Pond. And we're going to be talking more about your current neighborhood in March.
I'll look forward to that.
There you go. Good. Incidentally, if you'd like, if you know an individual or a company that would like to sponsor that presentation, we'd be interested in talking to you about that. Are there any other questions or comments people would like to make? Sir?
The city has a conservation easement very close to the Dairyfield school grounds. And I wonder if that easement includes the quarry site.
Darafield School? That's kind of on the other end, up near Southern New Hampshire University?
The Dairyfield.
You mean the junior high school? It's, was that Hillside?
Hillside.
Yeah, I don't think that's related up to this at all, because it's really not that close to where the ledge is located. Yes, sir?
I find the sort of parallel with this narrative, perhaps without groundings or might be wrong, to the Quincy had the benefit of the big dig to fill it in. But now, you go wander around there, and but they don't, they're still mining equipment around there and stuff. It's just been filled in for all of the same reasons why folks wanted to fill this one.
I think probably every town that's ever had a rock quarry has similar narratives. I came from Connecticut, and there was a town called Portland where my cousins lived that had a big rock quarry, and they had a lot of the same arguments. What do we do once it's no longer usable as a granite quarry? It starts to fill with water, and how do we keep the swimmers out of there? And the parents tell you, I don't want you to go up there, so what's the first thing you do is go up there. So probably that's a common story everywhere there's a quarry, but you're right. It's repeated in patterns. Anybody else have anything?
I
Sir?
was going to mention great pen and ink work that Paul Archambault did for Ledge.
Yes, there was a poster, and I think it was in conjunction with the city's bicentennial in 1976. There was a series of posters about various parts of town, and Paul did one specifically of the ledge.
Yeah, and Pine Island too.
Yeah, that's right, as a matter of fact. We have those in our collection at Amherst Street, but I don't think they're on display here. I'm looking at the staff. Yeah. Christopher?
I just think it's kind of amazing that it was all sort of spontaneous and not really sanctioned by an organization or government, and then it was so famous worldwide, which I didn't know. My aunt was in the France and probably wasn't very well. But I, when you're young, you don't know stuff.
Yeah, you wonder, what did our parents do when they were young? Well, this is it. Sir?
I think it's ironic that 3 years after women got the right to vote, they're already diving off the rocks.
Yeah. Well, there was equality certainly going on up there. Because in the group pictures, you see as many women as you do men. Absolutely. Way back in the back. I don't know. Does that ring a bell with anyone? I have not. No. If he was well known, I'm kind of surprised that he would have been able to get up into the ledge, because the city would probably have tried to squash that. They hadn't officially closed it yet, but they were certainly trying to close it by that time. Anybody else? Stan?
Boston got killed on a bicycle ride a few years ago, like 12 o'clock at night. He ran his bicycle. Boys were our son. He was a nice guy. He was always stand up by April.
Wow. That was news to me. I've learned something today. Anybody else? Yes, ma'am.
Who owns it today? Who owns the property today?
Today, the property is all owned by the city of Manchester. It's all considered part of Deerfield Park, even though it's closed to the public. But they own all that. And I didn't really go into it here, but in 1969, it was felt at the Recreation Committee that there was a need for a ski area. So the city took, I think, 12 parcels of land by eminent domain from the people who lived up there. And that's how they ended up with Nora Kennard's land finally in the 1960s. It had been through a couple of other owners in the meantime, but that all is owned by the city today. There is incidentally a walking path, a legal walking path, that goes all the way around the perimeter of the Ledge property and the McIntyre Ski Area and the Weston Observatory. It's a nice walk, especially in the summer months. Takes about 45 minutes maybe, at a leisurely pace. Anyone else? Well, whoops, I'm sorry, sir.
Could there possibly be any tools still there from when it was a quarry?
I'm sure there are. They have said on numerous occasions that they found equipment at the bottom because, again, we don't know exactly when it started to fill with water. One story said that the workers were there and they left for lunch, and when they came back, 18 inches of water had filled the pool. They came back the next morning and it was like 8 feet of water. So I've also seen a report that they were working in there and they did some blasting, and a dynamite blast shook open the springs and unleashed them, and they had to run for their lives that it filled that fast. We have not found any contemporary newspaper articles that tell us one way or the other, but we know it was sometime in the late 1880s. But in those days, there wasn't much media. There was really only newspaper. It was long before TV and radio. You would think that would have made news at the time, except that, again, there weren't that many people employed there. So the impact on the people of the city would have been pretty low. So we don't actually know. It still is a mystery today exactly when it's filled with water. I think on that note, on behalf of the Manchester Historic Association, thank you all for coming. We hope to see you again.